Our interview today is on the farm of Mr. Jim Moseley. Jim Moseley is a grain and hog producer in Tippecanoe County in central Indiana. He has a degree in horticulture from Purdue University. He has served on the Tippecanoe County School Board. He was an active participant in the Indiana Agricultural Leadership Program in the mid-1980s. More recently, he has served as a special advisor to the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and just returned from Washington, D.C., where he served as the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture for Natural Resources. It's our pleasure to be with you today, and I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about how you began in farming and how your operation has evolved over the years.
Well, we've been here for about 21 years. Kath and I were graduates from Purdue University in 1970, and looking for something to do with our lives, and just so happens that this farm came up for rent. We didn't have any money. We went to Farmers Home Administration and borrowed 100% of the money to start. Had 250 acres and 60-some gilts, I guess, and put ourselves into the farming business. In the 21 years since then, well, things have changed quite a bit. We're now at about 2,300 acres of land that we till per year, and this year we'll sell in the neighborhood of 12,000 head of hogs. We are in an expansion program on our way to about 15,000, and sell some breeding stock, primarily breeding gilts in the Midwest. Have 4 partners in the business. That's what's allowed me to be able to get away from the farm and go and do some of the public service kinds of things that I've had the opportunity to do. 4 business entities. It sounds kind of complicated, but in the final analysis, why it works for us. And with the 4 employees, it's something that has come together very nicely. I should say the 4 partners has come together very nicely, and it just works.
I know you've been associated with Purdue University as a student and in several advisory capacities. I'd like to ask you how your association with Purdue University has influenced either your farming operation or perhaps your involvement in the public area.
Well, both. It's helped dramatically. In fact, we give, on the production side and the farm, we give Purdue a lot of credit for where we are today. I've always thought that one of the real assets I had was to be close to the university and have access to the folks there.
You were a participant in the first Indiana Agricultural Leadership Program. Why don't you tell us just a little bit about what that program is, and then what experiences or benefits you had as a member of that first class?
Well, that program really evolved out of some other leadership programs that were funded by the Kellogg Foundation several years ago. I had been involved in a national competition for Outstanding Young Farmer. One of the other fellows that was involved in that had been a graduate of the California program, and we got visiting about it, and I saw the distinct difference in terms of his knowledge base and the skill level that he had, and I thought this is something that would be beneficial to Indiana agriculture leadership. So we were able to get this ag leadership program going, and it primarily is a program that is intended to give Indiana agricultural leaders the opportunity to expand their knowledge base, to improve and enhance their skill levels so that they can become better leaders. And one of the ideas was to make better leaders out of Indiana agriculturalists, not necessarily better agricultural leaders. I think we've done both. And I think the program now is, we are through at least 4 classes, some 120 participants in the state. Another class is ongoing now, is beginning to have pretty significant impact on the shape and the structure of Indiana agriculture. So I'm really pleased that it's been able to go as nicely as it has and be funded in the state. Purdue has had, again, heavy involvement in that entire program from the beginning, and that's been very helpful to make the program successful.
I'd like to explore now what factors cause you to consider involvement in public service at the county and at the state and national level.
Well, there was no plan. It isn't something that we consciously set out to do. I think it's something that was kind of built into the makeup of who I am and who Kathy was. I know I came from a background where family was heavily involved in public kinds of activities, and that it just came from a notion that I got from my grandfather that, you know, society gives you something and you have to give something back. And so, frankly, the opportunity came along to serve on the school board, and I thought at the time, now that's one of the things that one of these days, when I'm 40 or 50, I'd like to do, you know. And it came at an early age, and we interviewed, and they came back and said, "You're the person," and I was completely stunned that I would be serving on the school board at the age that I was. But we went ahead and did that, and I don't know, we've just done a number of things at an earlier age than we anticipated. I certainly had absolutely no plans of being involved in national policy like I was, and I was just sitting unexpectedly at my desk one evening in February in 1989, right after the elections, and a call came from Secretary Eider's office, and the invitation was there to come to USDA. I wouldn't have dreamed that that would have happened, but it did.
Let's talk a bit about your experience in Washington. Your first role there in the late 1980s was as an advisor to the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I wonder if you could share with us what were some of the issues that you became involved in as an advisor to the EPA?
Well, actually, the issues at EPA were more ag-related than the ones at the Department of Agriculture. I find that to be somewhat ironical, but at EPA, primarily involved in pesticides, worked very closely with the Assistant Administrator for Pesticides and Toxics. Of course, I came in about a month after the ALAR incident broke, and my first assignment actually was to go and talk to the apple processors and try and calm the waters just a little bit. I spent a fair amount of time working on biotechnology. It was, we were kind of in our infancy at that time in terms of trying to bring together biotechnology regulations, and they really needed some guidance. There was some people that had entirely different views about how stringent regulations ought to be. In fact, would have taken years literally to get biotechnology out for public use. Probably the thing, though, that was not directly issue related, but or as a broader issue, I spent a lot of my time mending fences when I was at EPA, and mending the fences between EPA and USDA, or even between FDA and EPA and USDA, because they looked at the world differently. And all of them dealt with issues that impacted agriculture, and I found that there was misunderstandings and that there was just personality conflicts that were standing in the way of us getting good public policy. And so I was kind of the person that was in there calming the waters a little bit and saying, now, you know, we need to take a different look at this policy, and, you know, let's consider this in a little bit different way. So I still feel like that the best work that I did for production agriculture was what I did when I was at EPA in terms of trying to bring the different factions together and at least get them to communicate, talk to one another.
Well, let me continue on that theme then. So after you had spent a couple of years or more with EPA, you had the opportunity to become the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture for Natural Resources. What were your responsibilities there?
Sharply different. I had the Soil Conservation Service and Forest Service, and I moved, while Soil Conservation Service had a lot of impact on direct production agriculture, on farmers, and to a certain extent on ranchers, I moved in to a whole different world in the Forest Service. A lot of Western issues, timber-related issues, grazing, of course, impacted ranchers significantly, but totally different kinds of issues, and some that were hard to make the connection to agriculture at all. For example, I became heavily involved in the Exxon Valdez spill. Now that happened, in fact, happened the day that I interviewed with Bill Riley at EPA. But that was an issue that carried on far beyond what the public involvement in it was, because The shoreline around the bay that was soiled was Forest Service land, and so we were the recipient of the dollars to clean up the oil spill. So, you know, it's those kinds of things that you think back and say, how did that impact farmers, or, you know, what's the direct relationship to production agriculture? There really wasn't much, but it did get me into some of the much broader environmental issues that I think are going to indirectly impact natural resource management and therefore production agriculture in the years to come.
We see in the newspapers and here in the news media in general a lot of discussion about saving the environment, and particularly concern about endangered species of wildlife. And I'm wondering, in your period of time as Assistant Secretary, what insights you might be able to give us in terms of how can we appropriately preserve endangered species and our natural resources, but at the same time create jobs, encourage economic development for our society.
Well, I think we have to understand that over the long term there is that conflict that's going to continue to occur between man and what man needs, and maybe to a greater extent what man wants, and the habitat needs of the rest of the world. And I don't know how that's going to work out. You know, it's kind of it's a little bit difficult to say it, considering the political environment that we're in Washington right now, but you have to begin to ask yourself the question, can we save every single species on the face of the earth, because we've been losing species for years. The issue on species protection, though, is that where we run into trouble is, and particularly I was involved in the spotted owl issue, we set certain expectations for people, for society. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, we promised those rural communities through our forest planning process that had been ongoing for some 10 or 15 years. We had promised those rural communities that there was going to be a consistent supply of timber out of those national forests, and they were going to have access to that, and they built their lives around it. Sawmills went in those communities, and they were the basis of the economy there. And so people developed expectations based upon what we as a society said, and then all of a sudden there's recognition that, but wait a minute, that may have some significant impact on habitat. And that's precisely what happened with the spotted owl. Because we did become too aggressive in terms of cutting some trees in the Pacific Northwest. We did, as a result of that, impact the habitat. And we finally came to blows over the issue in Congress and in the courts, and still don't have a resolution. If we're going to deal, I think, aggressively with the whole issue of habitat destruction and protection of endangered species, we're going to have to do it with better planning. And the Endangered Species Act, as it's set up right now, just simply doesn't give us the framework to do that.
When we deal with issues in the area of the endangered species, there are often several aspects that one has to look at. One are technical solutions that are sound based on good science. Secondly, would be good laws or regulations by the Congress. And then third is dealing with the political reality, the fact that different people, different groups in society have different goals and priorities. Any thoughts from your experience in Washington how we can try to bring these things together in order to formulate sound public policy to preserve the environment, but also to create jobs and economic opportunities?
You know, Marshall, it's kind of interesting the way you posed that, because you talked about the technical expertise, you talk about laws and regulations, and then you talk about the political world in Congress. And I would suggest that laws and regulations are political. It seems to me that the contrast there is between what we know technically, the professionals, our land managers, the people are trained through their land grants or through the university system to make these kinds of decisions. And then the whole other world of politics and the impact that the two of those then obviously has on law and regulation. And in my experience, I saw many times where we had the technical expertise. We knew what the right answer was, or at least we believed we knew what the right answer was. And yet that would get subjected to the political realities around it. And the laws and the regulations then would be driven by the political answer more than by the technical answer. Now that's not to say, and I wouldn't want a world where we had only political answers or only technical answers. And I just think it's important to understand that you have to figure out a way to meld the two. In the final analysis, as long as you're dealing with Congress, you're going to get, primarily though, a political answer.
In the news media, we often hear or have the impression that the environmental groups and farmers are in an adversarial relationship. Do you agree?
I'd like to say no, but the reality is that yes, they are. And it depends to a great extent on how you define environmental groups. It's easy to stereotype them and say they all belong in the same group, but that simply isn't the case. I know when I went to DC, in my first speeches I kept talking to agricultural groups about how they needed to work with environmental groups. And every once in a while I'd really get hammered. A little experience finally gave me an understanding of why that was the case, because there are some environmental groups that have their national agenda, and it doesn't make any difference what the right solutions are. You could, I mean, God could come in and mediate, or Solomon, and say, this is the right answer, and it wouldn't make any difference if it was delivered and it was enacted upon, because some groups are not driven by the solution as much as they are by the need to have a controversial issue on the table at all times. With those kinds of groups, we're always going to be in an adversarial relationship. But I also found that there were other environmental groups interested in natural resource policy that really were looking for solutions. We could sit down at the table. Many times there was a misunderstanding on their part as to what agriculture was all about. And if we could sit down and explain to them what production techniques we used and why we used them and a little bit about agriculture, there was a new understanding that they developed, and we were able then to continue the discussion, and we were able to then come to some reasonable compromises and solutions. So I have to kind of divide it up and say, with some groups, yes, there's an adversarial relationship. With others, no.
I think the other thing that's probably important to note that we talk about some environmental groups being in an adversarial role with farmers, but in my talking to farmers and surveys I've done of farmers, most farmers could be considered environmentalists also, because they too are concerned about their soil. It's their livelihood. It's where they get their drinking water from their own wells, and so they're concerned about their exposure to pesticides. Would you agree?
Yeah, it really depends on how you define an environmentalist. And again, you know, environmentalists tend to stereotype farmers into that guy that's out there that's raping the land and doing all these bad things, and we know that simply isn't the case. In fact, that's one of the major points that I guess that I try to make with agricultural groups, that let's don't get ourselves caught in a situation where we beg for regulation because we have a few of our own that's out there doing some things that are not very intelligent, because the bulk of agriculture is sensitive to the environmental issues. Once they understand what the problem is, and once a reasonable solution is offered, they'll follow it. It's just a matter making sure that we do that. And most of them will respond positively given that opportunity. It's those few that really cause us a problem.
As you look down the road into the future, into the next 5 or 10 years, what do you see as the emerging environmental policy issues that we will be facing in American agriculture?
Well, I think there's some good news here, and that is that I think that the issues that we have facing us, the serious environmental questions, not perhaps just the policy issues, but the serious environmental questions that's facing us as a society, are as much non-agriculture related as they are agriculture. For example, the issues of climate change, that debate will go on for a long time, particularly in the area of global warming. I do think that there is significant evidence in terms of destruction of the ozone layer, that clearly that's an issue that is concerning to us as a society. The whole question about trash disposal, if the rest of the world ever decides to catch up with the affluent countries like the United States in terms of what they do with their trash, that potentially I think is going to be a very serious problem. If you narrow it down though and look at agricultural issues, since we have significant impact on rural lands, that's where the majority of the endangered species, in fact, that's where all of the endangered species are at. And so I think habitat destruction, endangered species questions are going to continue to be around for a significant length of time, and I'm not sure how we're going to ultimately resolve that one. Notice I haven't said too much in the area of pesticides. I do think the questions about biotechnology will continue to be there. I'm not sure, my sense is that the questions, we will be able to provide the answers, and that biotechnology will move forward, not as quickly as perhaps we would like, but it will move forward. In fact, I think we have no choice if we're going to ultimately feed the world. The whole area of pesticides, I'm not as concerned about that. In fact, if you study an EPA evaluation that was done a couple of years ago, they put pesticides well down the list of serious environmental concerns to society. Somewhat related to the fact that we have done, the industry, the chemical industry has done a significant job in terms of improving the safety of pesticides. And so what people perceive as being serious problems, pesticides, groundwater, contamination problems and so forth, I think we are well along towards solutions there. It's some of these other issues that we've just begun to recognize what the problems are and just begun to think about what potential solutions are.
In recent years, we've added a number of regulations and guidelines that both industry and farmers must follow to try to manage in a more environmentally friendly fashion. Do you think with the regulations that farmers now face and the ones that we may add in the years ahead that we can still compete internationally in the commodity markets so that we can export what we produce so efficiently?
Well, I think it's going to be a close call. I am concerned about this and the relationship of American agriculture to the rest of the world. And that's the reason why when we come to these agreements like GATT, international agreements, that we do have these discussions about how different production systems are different, the countries, how they manage their different production systems, because it's obvious. It's raw economics that if our farmers are severely restricted in terms of using pesticides or fertilizers or whatever yield-enhancing inputs that we have available to us, and other countries, particularly developing countries, are allowed to do that does put us in an uncompetitive situation. So I'm concerned about that. On the other hand, the thing that I'm optimistic about is we have always been a technological leader in the world. And there's some things that are occurring in terms of solutions like site-specific technology, precise application of these inputs, We've been rather cavalier, I think, about the way we go about producing agricultural crops. So we go out there and we put a particular rate of pesticide, for example, over the entire field. We may only be trying to target 10 or 15 or 20% of the field. Site-specific technology is going to go a long way in terms of reducing the amount of impact that pesticides or getting the exact right amount of fertilizer out there that we need. That's where the hope, in my mind, is at. And if we are the country that's in a leadership position in terms of developing that technology, then we're going to be competitive. The one real concern that I have is that I see us continuing to reduce the amount of dollars that we're willing to put into research and development in this country vis-a-vis other countries in the world. I know Bob Thompson has a chart that points this out very clearly. And that is a concern that I think we in agriculture need to stand up and recognize, because agricultural technology hinges so much on research and development. And if we don't have the dollars going into it, then will we be a world leader? We have been. I have some real serious doubts as whether we'll continue to be.
Well, Jim, this has been a fascinating opportunity to visit with you today. I'd like to ask you one final question. Many of the people who will view this interview will be students, and some of them will be considering the possibility of a career in the area of public policy. I wonder what counsel or advice you might give them as they look forward to a future in the public arena.
Well, I'm not sure how you ever prepare yourself 100%. Clearly, as I worked through it in Washington, there were things that, to me, were obviously lacking. I wish that I'd spent a little more time in the legal area. I don't know that you need a law degree, but some additional time in the legal area. And I think if I'd had a little bit broader education, and when I was at Purdue, I did really try to expand it, but I think even broader yet, I'd have had more history, more sociology, more psychology. Clearly would have had a foreign language, not so much for the language itself, but for trying to master the skill of learning a language, so you kind of have the fundamental building blocks of how you go about getting the basics of a language down. Because there were a number of times when it would have been useful, because of the traveling I did, to very quickly pick up the basics in any given language. Those are some of the kinds of things, and I see we've had a lot of students that have worked here on the farm. I would guess now, over the years, probably 250 to 300 students that's come out part-time. And I continually see them, and it's irrelevant, I think, if you're going to be involved in leadership or in public service kinds of things, public policy kinds of things. I think it's even irrelevant, but I see too many undergraduates focus in too narrow at the undergraduate level, and I guess I would really encourage any student at that level to broaden their horizons as much as they can at the undergraduate level. Maybe even take a little time after you get done with your undergraduate degree and go out there and experience a part of the world, and then decide what you want to do with at least the next portion of your life. We change, seems like every 7 to 10 years, I think the statistics show, but decide what you want to do with the next portion of your life, and then focus in on that at perhaps a graduate level. But I see a mistake made too often of just being too narrow in our undergraduate education.
Jim, I want to thank you very much for allowing us to come out to your farm and visit with you today, and let you share with many people some of your experiences and observations, both in production agriculture but also in the public arena. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with Purdue University.